Up high here. I don't know. Let me just check down here. That's more friendly, isn't it? Everyone can still see me from at the back. Now, I am very pleased to be with you this morning. My name's Phill, for those who haven't met me. I'm very privileged and maybe a little bit intimidated to be asked to be part of this teaching series, which is, if you haven't caught up on it, asking life's biggest questions over a 4-week period, and hopefully giving some answers as well. It's a series that's designed to step through the huge story arc of the whole Bible, the story of creation and fall and redemption and new creation that's mapped out in the pages of the Bible from Genesis, where we are this morning, all the way through to the book of Revelation at the far end. The storyline which those of us who are Christians would say puts us in that picture and gives us context and meaning. Although, of course, every point of that Christian narrative, that biblical story, every point is contested in more and more ways. So we're dipping this morning here into Genesis chapter 1, which you might say is the most contested, the most challenged chapter of the whole Bible. And yet maybe also one of the most misunderstood chapters of the whole Bible in what it's actually setting out to say. And I want to suggest right at the start, there are actually much bigger issues at stake, a much bigger worldview challenge being made than the question that seems to be debated a lot about whether the world was actually made in 6 24-hour days, which for some Christians is as far as the Genesis debate ever goes. I want to suggest to you this morning the philosophical debate goes far deeper than that. It's helpful, I think, to take our minds back to the world of the original readers, which with a space of 3,500 years is kind of a little bit hard to do. Not to mention the fact that they lived in the ancient Near East in a very different world. The original readers are Israelites. That's who the book of Genesis was written for. They're surrounded by a vast array of religious options. And maybe when you think about it, that's not so hard to imagine today. It's a world where the default view was you would believe in whatever God you wanted to, usually with a hope of getting something out of that God. It was a world full of stories of gods doing battle with one another, caught up in the unpredictable chaos, trying to pacify whatever God you thought was the right God at the right way at the right time, and hoping for the best. The creation stories from those other gods said things like that the world and everything in it was a byproduct of the great battles of these wild gods. There were Babylonian stories, like the famous one called the Enuma Elish, which told a story like that. Now, Genesis was written in a world like that, offering a very different worldview, a very different perspective. Today, I guess, the challenges in some ways are different. Put aside the questions for a minute about science and the Bible, because they were never the questions that the text itself set out to answer. Because the bigger questions run on a level even deeper. And the challenge is, I want to suggest, even more fundamental. Christopher Watkin, in his book Biblical Critical Theory, says this. He says, if everything is just matter, material, plus time, plus chance, then nothing is personal. Think about that. What we think of as persons, whether yourself or your family or your friends, it's really just random, accidental atoms that are washed together for a moment and then gone. So he maps out two fundamental options. Now, I was going to apologise for the long quote that's about to come up on the screen, but I've heard Sen preaching here, so I know you'll be used to long quotes. Christopher Watkins says this: these are the options. Either we live in a universe in which everything personal eventually reduces to the impersonal, just atoms at random. Or we live in a universe in which everything impersonal can be traced back to the personal God. He says those are two very different universes to live in. Which one do you find more satisfying? Which provides a basis for a fairer, more compassionate society? A universe where everything personal reduces to the impersonal, or a universe where everything impersonal is transfigured by the reality and the will of the personal God? Now, of course, it's one thing to say, well, you might find living in a personal universe a much more satisfying idea. And I'd argue that a universe based at its very heart on personhood, backed by a personal God, creating a personal mankind as the essence of his image, I'd argue that's the only basis for things like fairness and compassion and love and joy and justice. You might differ, you might disagree, you might say, even then, just because you might prefer it doesn't mean it's actually true. But the point I want to make to you this morning is that the biblical worldview is one that is deeply rooted in the personal actions of a personal God, making personal people in an arena where love and justice and compassion, all those things are meant to be played out. In Genesis 1, it starts like this. Kezia read it before. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Now, this isn't just another one of those ancient Near Eastern stories about multiple gods fighting it out. This is one God speaking everything into being. First of all, it says formless, empty, dark. There's nothing good because there's nothing. Until one step at a time through the next few verses, God speaks and God speaks and God speaks. And things happen. He forms the formlessness. Then he fills the void, the emptiness. First of all, light itself, which is something that, as far as I can tell, science fundamentally cannot understand. I don't know if you're a sciencey person. I've read all sorts of sciencey stuff about particle and wave theory. I can't understand it anyway. You might explain it to me later. Light, the fundamental constant. God speaks it. There it is. And more than that, it is good. Which, if you read Genesis chapter 1, and you would have heard it as Kezia read, is the refrain over and over and over again. It's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. All of it. Not just the accidental product of gods at war. Not just a random collision of atoms, but out of God's intentional good. See, God, in his infinite freedom to do or not do, God, unconstrained by anything, delights in making and differentiating and filling with goodness and love and relationship at the heart of it. That, in a sense, is the theological framework being built by Genesis chapter 1. The Christian philosopher David Bentley Hart says it's all summed up by the idea he calls gratuity, which means a gift. He says science is desperately trying to find chains of causality that go all the way back. But what you need to understand is that the fundamental reason for existence is that it's all just a gift. It's generous of God. Other religions were all about trying to manipulate the gods for what you wanted to get out of them. But the biblical view is, what possible deal could you make with God when he gives us everything we have? Now again, you might be a sciencey person or you might be the artsy, creative type. I think I'm a little bit of both. Look at God's creation and it's both of those to the absolute max. It's the perfect blend of fine-tuned science and astonishing artistry. If any one of the 6 physical constants that described our universe varied by even a fraction, scientists say the universe would just evaporate in a flash or collapse into a pile of super compressed ash. The science of it all is spectacular. But then so are the colours and the shapes and the beauty and the sound of music. Formless and void, to full of beauty and colour and relationships and love, and God sees that it is good. Didn't have to be anything. Or he could have just left it all formless and void. But not by accident, it is good. More than that, by the time we get to verse 31, by the end of day 6 in the 7-day structure, it's not just good. Do you remember? It's very good. And God saw everything that he's made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. Most especially because of humanity. Don't know if you noticed the pattern, but by the end of day 5, it's good. By the end of day 6, it has gone to the next level because now there's us. Now, I don't want you to get a swelled head about that. This is not about arrogance. But did it ever occur to you that you are like the icing on God's cake? You and me, all of us together, they take God's joy in his creation to the next level. Because we are made in his image and likeness. Personalness, that's a hard word to say. Personalness, being a person, has moved from the domain of God into the creation in the form of man and woman. Look at the words on the screen, and again, it's just because God says so. It's verse 26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Now, there are all sorts of ideas going around as to why there's a plural there. See, in our image. It is suggestive right from the first page of the Bible, most theologians will say, of the idea of the Trinity, right from the start of the Bible. And then the question of what it means to be made in the image of God. But the first point to notice is that this is the thing that marks us, mankind, out from everything else that's already been formed and filled. We're still creatures, but unlike the rest of creation, we are like God in a particular way. Now, the passage doesn't explain it. It just states it. And so philosophers and theologians for centuries and centuries have debated what aspects of human nature make us actually God-like. Is it somehow that we are personal, whatever that means? Whatever it is that separates us from everything else, as well as from ChatGPT on your computer. It's just our ability to reason or to speak. As older theologians have suggested, the rise of AI challenges that idea. Is it more fundamentally our grasp of goodness and beauty and morality? Some have suggested that. The fact that we unlike anything else in creation, lie awake at night wondering why the universe works the way it does. The philosopher Martin Heidegger says that human beings are the one being for which our own being is a question. We alone scratch our heads wondering what on earth we are. See, cows don't do that. The one thing the passage does say is that because we're God's image, we're given the task of ruling the world under his authority. Now, it's exactly the language that used to be used of ancient Near Eastern kings. It would have been a familiar idea. What a king would do when they came and took over a territory with their army is they would set up an image of themselves in the city square. Here is a reminder that I'm the one in charge of this domain. Now, you see, we image God in the same way. A rule over creation as his representatives, not to consume it or destroy it, but to care for it. And in that way, in this biblical worldview, we really are special. Now, it's interesting, Article 1 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights says this. And the problem, I'm going to show you the statement in a moment, the problem is it's actually true, but when you reject the biblical worldview, I wonder on what basis they can say that it's true. The United Nations says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now you see, we are astonishing, we're valuable, each of us, but it's because in terms of Genesis 1, we are somehow made in the image of the Creator of the universe. And so verse 28, God blesses them male and female and says to them, be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth and have dominion over everything else I've made. Filling the earth and subduing it, as it turns out in the next section, means cultivate it, make things grow, build things, invent things. And so all the stuff we've done with our human creativity, which again is much like God's creativity. In other words, part of being human, it's all about being creative, shaping and forming and making beauty. Israel's role as the first readers of Genesis 1 is not in worshipping creation as other nations did, but caring for it, cultivating it, and being, in a sense, co-creators. Somewhere right in the middle of two other extremes, worshipping creation on the one side, or in greed, just totally consuming it and destroying it on the other. Last year you might have heard or seen it, if you were in Melbourne at the time, St Paul's Cathedral just down the block. They had an art installation, a huge globe of the earth hanging down inside the building from the roof, and they called it Gaia, the earth goddess, Mother Earth. Now that's a logical extension of what I guess you'd call green theology, worshipping nature. That is not us, that is not the biblical view. Nature is not a god. The biblical worldview puts us in the picture as the image of God's rule, developing, caring, gardening the creation on his behalf. And with all of that in place, verse 31, God looks over everything he's made, and that is the declaration. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. And from then on, there's nothing to do but on day 7, rest, which comes at the start of chapter 2. Work done. Rest with his good creation. Now, folks, I don't want to mess with next week's preacher. He's very good. But if you're following that overview program I mentioned at the start, you remember part 1 of the series is about creation. Part 2 next week is about what Christians call the fall and what goes wrong. Because you can't help but be aware when you keep hearing it's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good. You can't help noticing that the world that you and I live in isn't always like that. There are glimpses of it, but our world is full of mess and broken stuff and riots and wrongness. I was thinking the other day, it's like a beautiful kid's toy box. And yet every toy in the toy box, no matter how beautifully crafted and painted, is somehow broken. Woody with an eye missing, Buzz Lightyear with a cracked helmet. The merry-go-round doesn't go round anymore. Nothing quite works. And so there's suffering and there's pain and there's greed and there's everyone doing exactly what they like, no matter the consequences, to the world itself and to one another. And it's all because of what happens next. You'll see it next week, that the creation gets deliberately disordered in Genesis chapter 3. That instead of cultivating and caring for creation, we either worship it as if creation itself is a god, or we crush it and take whatever we can and in our greed leave it a ruin. And it's a tough place as a consequence. Everything that God differentiated, separated, made different, the distinctions get blurred. Everything ordered gets disordered or reversed. Everything to be cared for, we tend to use it or abuse it instead, or else bow down and worship it. And this idea of a good creation at rest with God, it's like a distant, long-lost memory. And everything is brought undone by death and decay. Now look, you know from your own life, don't you? That's what it looks like. There is chaos all around. Your mum gets cancer, your car breaks down, your leg hurts, the climate's changing, work is so boring and you have to go every day, uni's so hard. It's all like it's broken. The harmony in Genesis 1 is what it could have been and should have been, and if you follow the story through, is what we're told it will be. Now look, I'm not going to mess it up for the preachers for the next few weeks, but I'm not really just going to leave it there, because what if you don't come next week or the week after that? That'd be terrible. You'd miss the end of the story. It gets exciting. Week 3 is all about what Christians call redemption. It'd be a terrible shame to miss that. Or part 4, the new and restored creation. I just want to give you a really, really quick glimpse forward, which isn't an excuse not to come for the next 4 weeks. The story goes this way, that even though in the garden what happens next is that we collectively reject God's gift, even though the first man and the first woman think they can do better than God, think they can order things better than God, think they can decide what's good and evil for themselves, even though God had made it good in the beginning, God starts again. That's a pretty messy, complicated diagram there, but you've got man and woman in the garden. The serpent comes along and says, don't listen to God. The next big thing in the story is in Genesis chapter 12, a man called Abraham. And God starts again with him. And through him grows a nation called Israel, who God says will one day bring blessing to the world once again. Put things right. Restore the balance of rest, harmony between Creator and created. Which ultimately, after the very long story of the Old Testament, and after Israel fails as well, ultimately God does in person through Jesus Christ, who is in effect, the New Testament says, like a new Adam, a new start. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, "Thus it is written, the first man Adam became a life-giving being. The last Adam," he's talking about Jesus, "became a life-giving spirit. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven." Now you see, that is where our story is heading. That's where our future lies. That's our hope as we move towards those restoration ideals of God's good design, everything good at rest with him. And so piece by piece, as people of the Spirit, we can start to see and enjoy again some of the fruits of how things are meant to be. Even in the brokenness, we get to start to live as part of the new creation. Still suffering as part of the old, but glimpsing what lies ahead. Now, folks, that's just a little tiny glimpse of the picture that helps us make sense of the world. Next week, in more detail, part 2 and what went wrong. Then week 3 and 4, the story in much more detail of how God is putting it all back together. Let me pray. Lord God, you have made us part of the